This is the third part of my anti-movie theory for Jordan Peele's Us, and it will be looking at the character breakdowns. Do click subscribe down here. Right on time. The entry point to every movie is to have a relatable character. We look for ourselves on the screen, and we want to understand the story through what the character does. We want to empathize with the character. This is the only way we really get the motivations of what the character is going to do. We look at that and we think, oh, that's us. But in this case, that ain't us. Or at least it shouldn't be. Nobody, from the little girl to her parents, are really supposed to be completely relatable or understood.
And this is because they don't represent our reality. They represent the American fictional narrative, our facades.
The family is not quite right. They exist in an atypical depiction. They lean very close to the values of what the American dream are. The relationship between the parents is not a stable one or a supportive one. You have Gabe, who sees himself as being this patriarchal
figure representing fatherhood
in the traditional way that you might see in a sitcom. At the beginning of the film, he appears dominant yet benevolent in all of his actions, making choices on behalf of the family while also appearing somewhat the butt of a joke amongst the members of the family, as well as a source of comic relief for us as the audience. His relationship to his peers and contemporaries shows that he heavily bases his value on his
financial and material achievements.
Also, later in the film, we have the character wearing a Howard sweatshirt. What does that mean? Well, Howard is a historically black university that's often associated with the concepts of black excellence, has a great history, and has a long lineage of great graduates. Yet to be wearing so proudly this legacy of blackness and to also represent such an all-American traditional concept of manhood, something that seems more like the white ideal, is supposed to jar anyone who has any awareness of what the legacy of Howard University is. Let's say we don't even go that far. If you look at the parallel between all the characters in contrast with their tethered counterpart, in the case of Gabe, Abraham exists as a monster, uncompromising, domineering, hulking figure who's also, nearly blind. He doesn't see very well. This is the real representation of Gabe and his fictional narrative.
Abraham is who he really is, a bully without any vision.
Where he thinks he's a leader, he becomes a monster in the real world. Similarly, the adolescent daughter, Zora, who comes off very, deadpan and sarcastic, when contrasted with her tether version, Umbrae, is revealing who she really is, while depicted in a traditional fashion of being age-appropriately rebellious and cynical. In the real world, looks at the world and constantly is laughing at it. She's laughing and running from everything in the world in a way that it's off-putting. It's actually kind of scary. What she really is an adolescent losing idealism and innocence, replacing it with judgment, escapism, and self-deprecation. Another interesting scene in there when you see her talking to the young twins about not going into the water. I think that was one of the nods to some of the beauty standards that exist within, our black community in particular, and American culture in general, and its impact on the self-esteem of young women. In another scene, we see her scrutinizing her looks in the mirror in the bathroom briefly before being startled by her brother. I see this reality of her self-esteem reflected in the appearance of Umbrae. Her blotchy, seemingly lightened skin, chemical burns around the edges of her hair, all of which seems like an indication of somebody who's going through great lengths to not look the way that they are. Jason's character is the result of a trauma that has, in a way, shocked him out of the narrative that he liked to believe he is. They start the story off with him not really completely understanding the world that he's a part of. It's key to understand that there's something that's happened to Jason. Why would a little boy be playing with fire? Why would his mother allow him, or his parents allow him to be playing with fire. This is supposed to look strange to us. It's supposed to be something that we stop and say, this movie doesn't make sense. On the surface is a little boy who's playing with magic. In the real world, he's somebody that burned himself, the product of an accident that happened. And if you know about, the experiences of any type of childhood trauma, especially those that you may bring upon yourself, it can quickly shock you out of a sense of innocence, an ability to be protected from things that hurt you. And the reality is that it's particularly because of the fact that he's playing with fire
that his Tethered version, Pluto, had the experience
in the real world of burning himself. He understands some aspect of this false narrative and him being something real. He's innocent, but he's losing his sense of innocence, right? So when they go into the closet together, they're the two that, he doesn't try to harm himself immediately. He doesn't even try to hurt himself. He wants to play, right? He wants to have imagination. And that's where you see them, recognizing that, okay, well, as the story, I have the ability to control what you do. And it must be because I have the ability to control what you do that this thing happened to you. You burned yourself.
He is a young boy beginning to understand the very real threat that the world poses to him, and that things presented for him to play with might actually pose a risk to his well-being. The real world can be a dangerous place for him. As a side note, while race is not the central theme of the movie, I do not believe it is a coincidence that Jason is depicted as a young African American boy.
His awareness really happened as a result of that fire, of the trauma that he experienced.
And because of that, the mask then represents what he uses to cover up the reality of who he truly is. It's a device of childhood that allows him to hide from his ugly truth, to resist the real world he must face.
Also at the end, when the Jason of the narrative, the false narrative, decides to kill the one who's the Tethered, when he decides to kill him by simply having him model or emulate what he does, it's one of these don't try this at home moments, right? Because the mom in the preview, she says, be careful, and laughs. You watch the film and she says, don't burn the house down. The experience that Jason had parallels the experience that Adelaide had, in the sense that it was a trauma that shook her awareness of what she is. When we learn that Adelaide actually switched with herself as a child, it's probably really important to think about the twist of the movie this way.
At a very early age, Adelaide became aware of what the world was and what the world was not. She became aware of who she was and who she was not. And here is where her metaphoric switch occurred. I'll explain. When you become aware
of who you want to be, or a false narrative of yourself, you're introduced to it. We may even see a TV show, look at this person and say, that's how I want my life to be.
Or when you become aware that who you wanted to believe you were, you are not, you may go through a bit of a crisis. The reason being is
the fact that you were made aware of it then becomes the life conflict you have to live with from there on. We go through cognitive dissonance. I can say this is the type of life I'm having, but in reality, I know that this type of life I'm actually having.
And this is exactly what Adelaide/Red was experiencing. Her awareness
of all of these things
placed her at odds with herself, because on one end, she had to live denying the truth that would turn her world upside down. On the other end, she resented herself for suppressing that same truth, because that truth would ultimately set her and everybody else free. And this is how she was different than everyone else. She knew they were Tethereds. She was one. And no matter how much you may suppress this knowledge, being aware of this facade places your awareness
in two places at once. You're living in both worlds at once, because you're actually connected to who you really are Not what is in the body or the mind, but what the soul really is.
Red knew she was Adelaide. Adelaide knew she was Red. Because they are, and always were, the same person.
So in that regard, we say, oh, well, she switched with her. Well, it was just the fact that she became conscious of it.
It, of course, being the tethering or control at play in her life,
placing her in both the position of prisoner and captor. Because when you're conscious of it, you're in both at once. Does that bring you toward the liberation of other people to what you become aware of? Does it lead you toward a stronger suppression of what you're aware of?
Thanks for watching, and please click subscribe for more videos on this and other topics in the near future. This is Uncle Baye, and this is Right on Time.